Can you hear me? Yeah?
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm going to. Well, I also come from living near a vast amount of fresh water. I think where I live, it's among the deepest in the world. It's well over 300 meters deep just down the road, so I have to be careful when I go swimming. And it's outside Geneva. So it's great to be here this afternoon. This is one of a series of events, as some of you will know. And I know that the really important issue for you here is fracking, and I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. But what we've been trying to do is conduct a series of events around the celebration of the 800th anniversary of the Charter of the Forest. And after today, and we're hoping that many of you will continue to be involved and that you will help us refine what you think should be the priorities, we're going to be holding a meeting in the House of Commons on Tuesday evening, and then there's going to be a big conference in Lincoln next Saturday on the 11th. And one of the objectives that we've got is the development of a Charter of the Commons. And I hope that all of us can think of what you would like to be putting into such a charter in 2018. What sort of issues do we really want to give priority to? Now, I came across the Charter of the Forest many years ago, shortly after we established an international network to promote basic income. And we set it up in 1986, and gradually been growing around the world. Today we have thousands of members, and we have networks in 35 countries, members in 50 countries, and often we have a little game. The game is who originated the idea of everybody having a basic income? And people have come up with Thomas More, Thomas Paine, various people. But I want to nominate William Marshall. And I'll come to who William Marshall was in a moment. Now, William Marshall was the regent of the young King Henry III in 1217. England had just been invaded. The last invasion of Britain had just taken place. And in May 1217, at the Battle of Lincoln, the French were defeated. And there were a lot of widows around. A lot of commoners had lost their lives or lost limbs. And William Marshall had been the great military leader of the time. And imagine the scene on November the 6th, 1217, the original St. Paul's, probably was a dark, dank morning, just imagine it. A 10-year-old king, probably dressed in fancy robes, probably didn't know what was happening, and William Marshall and a cardinal put their seals to two Magna Cartas. Actually, they were on that day was when the Magna Carta became the Magna Carta. It had been the Charter of Liberties in June 1215 in Runnymede, and had been rejected straight afterwards. It became the Magna Carta, sealed in the name of the king on that November 6th day, alongside another Magna Carta. It was called the Magna Carta de Foresta. We all know it today as the Charter of the Forest. Now, there's an irony, because what started that day was very strange, because the original charter of the Magna Carta was shortened from 63 articles to 47 that day. And as Peter said, the Charter of the Forest is very short, 17 articles. One of the problems it has is it is extremely difficult to read. We can say, as social scientists, go and read it. You can read it on Wikipedia or even in a number of places. But it has concepts that have gone out of use. Many of the terms that Peter's mentioned, and I'll mention a couple more, have long since ceased to be used. Now, as you all know, the Magna Carta was celebrated in June 2015 in Runnymede. Prime Minister, the Queen, Archbishop of Canterbury, all the dignitaries of the state went, including the Attorney General of the United States. And we actually had been up on the hill in the forest. Julie invited me and others did, speaking in the eco-village, which was occupying the woods above Runnymede. And that was a rebellious sort of Occupy thing. Tragically, they were thrown off. But the interesting thing was that the state of Britain, the government, spent lavishly celebrating the Magna Carta. And in the House of Lords, actually it was a Liberal Democrat lady asked, are you going to have celebrations for the Charter of the Forest in 2017? The Lord Foulkes, Minister of Justice at the time, he's probably fallen on his sexual harassment case this week. He airily dismissed the idea and said it's unimportant and it has no international ramifications. So when we were preparing for these events, I wrote to Noam Chomsky and asked him would he write an endorsement. We got Peter's endorsement and involvement, but I also wrote to the American Bar Association, which is the official organ. And they have kindly given us a tribute, saying that the Charter of the Forest was very instrumental in the US Constitution. Unimportant, eh? And Lord Foulkes should be reminded of his idiocy, but there is no official celebration. So what we're doing is a sort of poor man's equivalent. Now, there are a number of things I want to say about the Charter and then make a few comments of relevance today. You can interpret the Charter of the Forest as the first environmental charter in history. Unimportant? I don't think so. It wasn't as perfect as any of us in this room would have accepted, but it set many principles that Elinor Ostrom went later to introduce, for which she got a Nobel Prize in economics. But you can find the principles that Ostrom promoted in the Charter of the Forest, particularly the idea of stewardship. You can't have a commons unless you have good governance and good stewardship. And if you read the Charter of the Forest carefully, particularly with the idea of verdurers, the stewardship of preserving the commons, to make sure you don't have the tragedy of the commons where it's depleted, it's reproduced, is very fundamental and embedded in the Charter and a lot of the events that followed. Now, the Charter of the Forest has another distinction, which is that it was the longest on the statute books of any piece of legislation. It was on the statute books of Britain for 754 years. Sadly, it was only repealed in 1971 by Ted Heath's government, replaced by a very long-winded charter that didn't have the principles I'm going to be talking about. Very important. The Charter of the Forest has another very important radical distinction. It was the first charter of the propertyless, the commoners. And that stood alongside the Magna Carta, because the Magna Carta can be seen as a charter for property rights. But the Charter of the Forest was basically a charter saying property rights have limits. And in particular, the monarchy and the state don't have complete right to land. Think of the time. It was extraordinarily radical. Think of it. Here we had William the Conqueror. He came, he took a lot of land with his bandits and set up 25 royal forests. Between him and King John, by 1217, John was dead 2 years, but they were 143 royal forests. They'd enclosed and taken land from the commons and engrossed and enclosed in a vast way. 143. And here we had a charter being sealed by the regent, giving all that stuff back. What a rare victory for the common man and woman. Remarkable victory. It was a class-based charter, and I doubt it had ever been passed had there not been a 10-year-old king. If he'd been an adult, that would have been a different story. When he became an adult and he was required to put his own seal on it in 1225, he was furious. And according to the historical accounts that I've read, he made over 50 attempts to revoke the charter in his long reign of 56 years. He failed because once it became part of the state, the people kept it going. And for hundreds of years, it had to be read out 4 times a year in every church in England. I don't know how the people understood it, because it was in Norman French, and then it was Latin, and then it became English. So it was a long-standing tradition. But it helped in the defense of it. Now, another aspect, and this is why I'm most interested in it, because I support a basic income, and I have a few copies of my new book on the subject if you're interested, is that I believe a basic income for everybody is a matter of social justice. The land and the resources under the land and our commons belong to us. And you can interpret the us and the land and the resources as saying, look, this wealth that's created by all of us and our ancestors, we should have a basic income as an inheritance, a social dividend on our collective wealth. And if you look at the charter, it is remarkable in that respect. It has this wonderful thing, and Peter was talking about it. It's the first charter in history to give every man and woman and child the right to subsistence. A right to subsistence. And all the individual things like pannage, herbage, piscary, the right to fish, turbary, very important, particularly even today in Scotland. The right to turbary means the right to have peat to use for fuel. Very critical. The estivars that's been mentioned, which were the right to necessities. That morning, that great statement about widows had the right to refuse to be remarried, which was a big advance, because they were regarded as chattels before. So it was the first feminist advance that day. And not only did they have the right to refuse to be remarried, but they had the right to estivas on the commons. And what that meant is they had the right to have the necessities to survive. And that included lovely, lovely thing that's in the charter, the right to marl. You see, it's difficult to read today because many of these words have gone out of use, but the right to marl was vital in those days. What it meant was that you had the right to take clay and things from under the soil, get it where we're going? For your own use, but not for commerce. Right? That's a very important thing, because marl meant you could have clay to make utensils. You had clay to make your home. You had clay to build ponds so that you could have your own fish stock and water supply. All of these things were a matter of subsistence. And you also, one of the questions was about taking wood. It wasn't only taking dead wood, it was taking the underbranches, where the great tradition of pollarding started. And that's why I would be shouting at the Sheffield Council today. How about a little pollarding? Right? So we have another. How many minutes? 2 minutes, help. Okay, but the next principle, which those of you who are social scientists would be interested in, is this is the first charter in history which asserted a universal right to work. Because it said people have the right to take means of subsistence and raw materials for their own production. That's the right to work. It's not the duty to labor. It's far more radical in that respect than the Communist Manifesto or the Soviet Constitution or the Labour Party Constitution. It's a right to work. That's vital. It's also, that morning, a first feminist charter, the two of them together, and I've mentioned that. The last point I want to make about it is this. I hope, please give me just one more minute for that after that. Which is that it asserted something very fundamental to the Enlightenment that was to come much later. It is an assertion of republican freedom. The assertion that people had the right to rule their own lives and develop the capacity in their communities of self-governance. A very important thing. Now, the Charter of the Forest suffered from 5 plunders of enclosure. The first had taken place around that time. The second, the Tudors. Henry VIII organized the mass confiscation of 10 million acres of land, which were handed out to his favorites and so on. Had no right. So we had dukes and everything given land, hundreds of thousands of acres. Today, we still have dukes with hundreds of thousands of acres. Then after that, Cromwell distributed a whole lot more. And then in the 19th century, all the enclosure acts, individual enclosures where one duke got a bit of favours from in the House of Commons with another few more dukes, so they all agreed. 7 million acres were given out. 7 million acres. And they are still today. So nearby here, the Duke of Buccleuch has some of his land, 277,000 acres he has. Work it out. Try walking around it. Now today we have a chance. A chance because this government has organized the 5th plunder of the commons. I've tried to develop it in a book called The Corruption of Capitalism, which I have a few copies as well. But this government has organized an extraordinary thing, because we're no longer just seeing the plunder of the commons in the countryside, which we think about, but we're seeing thousands of very, very valuable urban land, cities, POPs, privately owned public spaces. We've even got an acronym for it. We must reverse that. It's one of the things I'm pushing in this draft that you're going to help us do, is that we must roll back POPs. Large parts of our cities are being privatized, being enclosed and encroached, given away. And it turns out that a large part of it is being given to Russian and Malaysian and Middle Eastern oligarchs who contribute very nicely to the Conservative Party. I mean, they must do something with some of their money, but we are losing our urban commons. And I want us to think of fracking as one of the worst aspects of what's taking place. We know that. We know that. We're all agreed, I hope, in this room. But it's part of a generic plunder of the commons. And we must fight for it. We must fight for water renationalisation. Water is a natural public good. It should be part of our commons. We must fight to dismantle what the Tories have set up, a natural capital committee. How to turn all the commons into profit making. It exists. I discuss it. The terms of reference. You should know about it because it's a racket. We should be mocking and saying the first thing a new government should do is tell them all to go back home and wash their mouths out or do something better. But we need our commons back. And fracking is obviously the place to start. And I'd like to quote, by means of ending, what the Secretary of State said just before the last election. No doubt some of you know it. We have agreed an outright ban on fracking in national parks and sites of special scientific interest. Within weeks of getting back into government, the same person, the same minister, authorised fracking under the national parks. You can't get more hypocritical than that. We all need to stand up, and I am incredibly proud to be here. Thank you very much.